Hey, and welcome to Gathered in One. This is episode 3 of our Book of Mormon Found series, and in this episode we are going to walk through and create an internal model of the Book of Mormon together. This video is made to go with my article on my Gathered in One site, all right, https gatheredin.one, entitled Book of Mormon Geography, an Internal Model. So if you'd like to, you can open that up in a browser and kind of follow along and get a lot more information, or you can just watch the video and we will go through all of the references and scriptures together. I'm going to pull up the site really quick right here, and you'll see that on the site I start right off the bat with a couple of the most dominant internal models that you end up seeing on the internet that people have made for the Book of Mormon. And you'll notice that they're pretty consistent. Most of the good internal models of the Book of Mormon are consistent because the geography of the Book of Mormon in the book itself and the text itself is pretty consistent and fairly detailed. Jumping right in, you'll see that the article is composed first of an outline where you can kind of jump to individual cities and lands that are explained in the Book of Mormon, and then I have detailed explanations. If you go to any one of those, you'll see I kind of outline every single instance where that land or city is mentioned, and then the references, so that you can click on any of the references and immediately see the actual scripture that explains it. You can also see up top, I go through a little overview and then show my internal model that I've made, as well as some notes on distances and the narrow neck and some various things. But in this one, we are going to focus on one specific part of this. If you notice right here at the beginning of the overview, I have a thing where I do an exposition on chapter 22 of Alma, right? And Alma 22 is kind of a detailed breakdown. It's the one chapter in the entire Book of Mormon that gives a general overview of the entire Book of Mormon lands. So we're going to go to that article and then just walk right through it, and we're going to actually build the internal model as we read it, right? And the verses in this chapter are a little bit, like a lot of parts of the Book of Mormon and the Bible in general, they're like run-on sentences, right? I mean, there's not a very modern sentence structure to these verses. Some of them can be incredibly long and just like have so many little tangents and details. So I've broken them off line by line, so it makes it a lot easier to read. And then I've kind of added little parentheses that show what each pronoun is referring to, because it can get kind of confusing. You can go through, see if you agree with my additions. They're all really obvious. They're in brackets. And you can pull up the original text as well if you'd like to read it without my additions. So let's just read right through it and draw it as we read. Okay, so you can see here anywhere where there's something written in all caps or in brackets, that's my text. So I've added quite a bit of clarification in here because of the run-on sentences. It can be a little bit difficult to follow. But I've got the original text right here on the right. So you can see that pretty much all of my clarifications are really pretty obvious. I think that there's very few people that would have any issue with clarifications I've had, but they really do make it a lot more clear. Let's just start though right here. Okay, so verse 27, right? The king says, as he's sending out this letter to the people in all of his lands, it says, "And it came to pass that the king of the Lamanites sent a proclamation throughout all the land, right, amongst all his people," right? These are the Lamanites in the land of Nephi, "who were in all his land, who were in all the regions round about," right? Round about his land. So, which land of Nephi, obviously that's what we're talking about, was bordering even to the sea on the east and on the west, right? So he's saying here the land of Nephi was bordered by the sea on both sides, had a sea on the east and on the west. Some people might take issue with that and be like, well, look, maybe it's saying that the land of Nephi was only bordered by the sea on the east, but not the sea on the west. But that does not work. You'll see in the very next verses, it talks about specifically a sea east and a sea west bordering these lands. Let's continue so that you know for sure that my brackets here are not inventing something. They're clarifying something that is obvious within the text, right? "And his land of Nephi, which was divided from the land of Zarahemla by a narrow strip of wilderness." So there's a narrow strip of wilderness between the land of Zarahemla and the land of Nephi. Okay, now this is the part I was talking about right here. "Which narrow strip of wilderness ran from the sea east even to the sea west and round about the borders of the seashore," right? Obviously the seashore on both sides. We have specifically here, it ran from the sea east to the sea west. So when we go back up here and say, which is bordering even unto the sea on the east and on the west, is it talking about a sea east and a sea west? Obviously, right? I mean, the sea wouldn't just disappear between the narrow strip of wilderness and the land of Nephi. Let's actually draw it so you know exactly what I'm talking about, right? So we'll open up a little drawing program here. I've got all the elements here. So we have a sea east, right? We have a sea west. It talked about a land of Nephi. It talked about a land of Zarahemla, right? It talked about a narrow strip of wilderness that separated the two, right? And it said on the narrow strip of wilderness and the land of Nephi, it was bordered by a seashore. Okay, so we've got a sea east and a sea west, land of Nephi, narrow strip of wilderness. Okay, maybe we'll just pull these all a little further south because as you see, we're going to stack more things on top of it as we go through this. Right, so when it comes to like applying this internal model to an external model, whether we be like the Heartland model or any of the Mayanland models, the Greek Alba or the Sumacinta models, or a South America model, right? We've got to have these elements. So I hope that you see here that there has to be a sea east and a sea west, right, that bounds either side of the narrow strip of wilderness and the land of Nephi, and as we'll see in a second, also the land of Zarahemla. Okay, let's continue on. Okay, so which narrow strip of wilderness ran from the sea east even to the sea west and round about on the borders of the seashore. So that narrow strip of wilderness runs round about, right? One of those lands. We're not sure here whether it's talking about it, but it's running round about either the land of Nephi or the land of Zarahemla, about on the borders of the seashore, probably on both sides. Okay, and so we're probably still talking about the wilderness, and it ran from the borders, right, of the aforementioned narrow strip of wilderness, right, and the borders of the narrow strip of wilderness, which was on the north of what? Well, this is all from the reference point of the land of Nephi. So obviously, which was on the north of the land of Nephi by the land of Zarahemla through the borders of Manti. Okay, so we have another land that we just got introduced to. Okay, it ran from the borders of the aforementioned narrow strip of wilderness, which was on the north of what? Of the land of Nephi by the land of Zarahemla. Okay, so he's talking about the borders here that are bordering up along the seashore, obviously, right? And so those borders of the seashore, right? That wilderness that went along the borders of the seashore, and it went along the borders of the wilderness, which was on the north of the land of Nephi by the land of Zarahemla through the borders of Manti by the head of the river Sidon. Okay, so we have a head of the river Sidon, which is associated with the narrow strip of wilderness that goes between the land of Zarahemla and the land of Nephi. Does that make sense? Right? These run-on sentences are really hard to follow, but if you walk through it slowly, you can see like this is what it's talking about. And thus were the Lamanites and the Nephites divided. Okay? So we need to just specify here that the land of Manti and the head of the river Sidon is part of this narrow strip of wilderness, which runs from sea east to sea west, that divides lands of the Nephites and the lands of the Lamanites. Okay? Does that make sense? So let's go back to our map really quick and put some of those aspects. So we know that a narrow strip of wilderness divides them, but we also know that there's some kind of a Manti that is associated with that narrow strip of wilderness. It doesn't say whether it's like on the north or the south, the narrow strip of wilderness, but it's like saying it's associated, it's dividing it. It also said that there's a river Sidon of some sort that's associated with that narrow strip of wilderness. Now, which way does it run? Does it run like north-south? Does it run like east-west? We don't know yet, right? We're going to keep reading and see if we get any clues in the text. We just know that there is a river Sidon somewhere associated with the land of Manti and a narrow strip of wilderness that go from the sea east to the sea west, which divide the land of Zarahemla and the land of Nephi. Okay, we can all agree on that. Okay, and thus were the Lamanites and the Nephites divided, right, in their land of Zarahemla and their land of Nephi. And it's confusing because the Lamanites actually live in the land of Nephi, right? Because the Nephites abandoned the land of Nephi, and then the Lamanites took it over. We get that elsewhere in the text. Okay, so let's keep going. Now, the more idle parts of the Lamanites lived in the wilderness and dwelt in tents, and they spread through the wilderness on the west, okay, in the land of Nephi. Okay, so we've got Lamanites on the west by the sea, obviously. We've already covered that. Yea, and also in the west of the land of Zarahemla. So we've got Lamanites in the west of the land of Zarahemla in the borders by the seashore, right? Which seashore is it talking about? Well, we just barely said it's in the west, right? They were spread through the wilderness on the west. So which seashore is he talking about? The west seashore, obviously. So there is a west seashore west of the land of Zarahemla that is filled with Lamanites. And that's going to be important when we go through something here in a little bit. We're going to talk about a new border that's created where Captain Moroni kicks everybody out and makes them go south of the land of Zarahemla. So anyway, hold on to that thought. but really cement in your mind, right? Any of your friends, anyone who's like kind of espousing a model, and I'm kind of thinking about the heartland here. If there isn't a west sea, west of the narrow strip of wilderness, west of the land of Nephi, west of the land of Zarahemla, you've got a problem, right? Because he's saying right here that there were Lamanites living in the wilderness on the west in the land of Nephi, and also in the west in the land of Zarahemla, in the borders by the seashore. Obviously, the west seashore. Okay, and in the west in the land of Nephi, in the place, right, of their father's first inheritance, right? So obviously their father's first inheritance is where they first landed with a boat. So we're obviously talking about a seashore here, right? So in the west of the land of Nephi, in the place or in the seashore of their father's first inheritance, and thus bordering along by the west seashore, right? Can you think of that any other way? I mean, I know a lot of people haven't really gone through this carefully enough in their minds, and so they just kind of like, it's almost like taking a dartboard and just throwing darts on there and creating like some kind of lollygag model in their mind. I really hope that you see what this is saying and that there really isn't any other way to read it, okay? So let's pull up our model. It was very specific. There is a sea west. There is a west seashore. That west seashore is west of the narrow strip of wilderness. It said that specifically. And now it's saying specifically that it's west of the land of Zarahemla and west of the land of Nephi. And that there is a first inheritance somewhere by the land of Nephi. And you'll see there's actually a scripture that equates the land of inheritance with the land of Nephi. Meaning they are in the same, the land of inheritance is in the land of Nephi, right? But we said here it is in the west seashore. So maybe it's here, but it is in the west by the seashore. Does it say south seashore? No, right? This is in the west, not in the south. Okay, so let's keep going and see what else that we find. But I hope that we're really clear on these seashores because it is unmistakable. You can't have it any other way. That's why all the internal models are so consistent. And once again, I'm just going to go back so that you can see these different internal models, right? And why they are kind of shaping up to look like what we're drawing. It's because of this chapter. You can't get away from that West Sea and that East Sea and the narrow strip of wilderness and Manti. On with the story. Okay, so 29. And also there were many Lamanites on the east, right? On the east of what? Well, we're talking about the land of Nephi and the land of Zarahemla, so probably on the east of the land of Nephi and Zarahemla by the seashore. Which seashore? Well, we're talking about the east. Obviously, it's the east seashore, right? So by the east seashore, whether the Nephites had driven them. So now we have an east seashore in addition to a west seashore. And the Lamanites live in the west and east seashores, both of the land of Nephi and the land of Zarahemla. They're wrapping up along the Nephite lands in the land of Zarahemla. And thus the Nephites were nearly surrounded by Lamanites. That's what I just said, right? Because it's what he just explained. They're wrapping up along the seashores, even in the Nephite lands. And so they're almost surrounded by the Lamanites. All right. Nevertheless, the Nephites had taken possession of all the northern parts of the land. Okay. And we're going to pull this up just so that you can follow along over here as well. Let's pull both of these up. Okay. So the Nephites had taken possession of all the northern parts of the land. That's kind of interesting. Northern parts of what land? I mean, probably the entire land, right? The whole land southward. We're about to hear more about that. So, okay, so we know that the Lamanites have taken control of the seashore and kind of surround the Nephites, but the Nephites have taken possession of all the northern parts of the land, bordering on the wilderness at the head of the river Sidon. All right, so this, I think, is talking about where the Nephites have taken possession. So maybe all the northern parts of the land of Nephi, maybe all the northern parts of the land southward. We're going to find out. So the Nephite lands go bordering from the wilderness at the head of the river Sidon. We already established that wilderness is the narrow strip of wilderness. That's where the head of the river Sidon and Manti are, right? So having possession from the east to the west, roundabout on the wilderness side. Okay, and that's interesting. We see that 3 other places in the Book of Mormon where it says about the wilderness side, right? Like that is an actual proper term, proper noun, right? So there is a wilderness side of the land, and we'll find out that it is on the west, right? The west side of the land is the wilderness side. So our model needs to have a wilderness side. Roundabout on the wilderness side, which we'll find out later is the west. On the north, right? On the north of what, right? Probably on the north of the land of Nephi and Zarahemla, even until they came to the land which they called Bountiful. Now there's the indicator of what he's talking about, right? So the Nephites have taken possession of all the northern parts of the land from the wilderness, right? Just the narrow strip of wilderness at the head of the river Sidon, from the east to the west, round about on the wilderness side, on the north, until they came to the land which they called Bountiful, okay, which is north of the land of Nephi. We're going to read more about that. And it, right, we're talking about Bountiful, obviously, and Bountiful bordered upon the land which they called Desolation. Okay, so we've got a Bountiful and a Desolation. Like, how are they arranged? Like, let's pull up our map really quick, just so we can realize we're going to be assembling that. Okay, so they own a land, and there is some kind of a wilderness side here, and there's a land of Bountiful and a land of Desolation. But how are they arranged? Like, is it maybe like Bountiful is next to Desolation, Bountiful is above Desolation? Let's keep reading and see if we can find out, right? Okay, and it, Bountiful, bordered upon the land that they call Desolation. It, now we're talking about Desolation, being so far northward that it came to the land that had been peopled and destroyed by the Jaredites, obviously, right? Whose bones we have spoken. So Desolation is so far northward. So we're going to really quick just make sure that we have Desolation so far northward. It never talks about Bountiful as being so far northward, only Desolation. Okay, and they, the Mulekites, right, because it's just talking about was discovered by the Mulekites, or the people of Zarahemla, it being the place of their first landing. And they came from there, right? Once again, we're talking about Desolation. So they came from there up into the South Wilderness. Okay, what is the South Wilderness? This is either the narrow strip of wilderness, or maybe there's one south of Nephi, but there's a South Wilderness. So I'm thinking likely south of the land of Nephi, or perhaps only south of Zarahemla or Desolation, but there is a South Wilderness. We're going to hit that in a second as we go to the map. And thus the land on the northward, right, of Bountiful was called Desolation, and the land on the southward was called Bountiful. Okay, that's really the part we wanted to get to here, because there's all these like really vague terms. If you don't break them out, they get really confusing. But at least here, it totally specified that we've got a land on the northward called Desolation and a land on the southward, which is called Bountiful. And some of this stuff, some of these notes that I've added are going to become more clear as we read a little further. But let's just go back to our map and realize now that we have our answer, right? The land of Desolation is the one that is so far northward. So it's obviously really far northward. And it said right there that the one on the northward is Desolation, one on the south is called Bountiful. Okay, so then we have our right order here. We know that these are not next to each other, right? The land of Desolation is so far northward, and the land south of Desolation is Bountiful. Okay, so we've got the right configuration here, right? Okay, let's move on. So it, a minute ago we were talking about the wilderness. So here it is going to be referring to the wilderness, obviously. It being the wilderness, which is filled with all manner of wild animals of every kind, a part of which had come from the land northward for food. Okay, so this same wilderness that we were talking about before has animals coming from the land northward for food. Now that's pretty important too, right? We know that there must not be any kind of a massive river between like that land northward and that land southward, right? Because then it wouldn't be a migration corridor. Like this is a migration corridor. It's saying that the animals come from the land northward down southward through some kind of a geographic thing without a barrier, right? They're coming down here for food. So when it comes to applying this internal model to an external model, there's not like a little ocean or a massive river or anything between these areas, because the animals are coming down from the land northward for food. Okay. Now, it was only the distance of a day and a half's journey, right? I deal with that in my model itself here. Well, there's a whole section here you can go through that talks about distances, right? And especially the distance part I pull from early Spanish codices where they're talking about to the Native Americans, right? In this case, the Aztec, and they say, how much they usually made in a day, right? And then it was about 15 miles a day, which is pretty typical, right? People who are used to walking around, they can walk 15 miles in a day. That's a pretty easy walk for them. But it could be maybe from 10 to 20, so let's just average 15 miles a day. Okay, so now it was only the distance of a day and a half's journey, so that's going to be like 15 to 30 miles for a Nephite on the line Bountiful and the land Desolation. Okay, this gets kind of almost confusing, because now we're talking about a line Bountiful, and a line Bountiful that is somehow maybe adjacent or associated with the land of desolation. A line bountiful and the land desolation. From the east to the West Sea, right? So does that mean from the East Sea to the West Sea? Maybe. It doesn't say that, right? It says from the east something. So is it talking about the line here? Is this line bountiful? What he's saying from the east of the line bountiful to the West Sea? Or is he saying from the East Sea to the West Sea? It could be either, right? So, I mean, that's why in these, like my model, I have a specific thing in mind, but I want to just make clear that the text itself, in all my parentheses, I'm really trying to be very specific and not catering it to my model or anything. It could be from the East Sea to the West Sea. That's definitely one way to read it. Or it could be from this line bountiful, right? Some aspect of it to the West Sea. Let's keep going and see if we have more clues that will kind of give us a hint. And thus the land of the Nephi and the land of Zarahemla were nearly surrounded by water. Okay, so we already kind of went through how the land of Zarahemla was nearly surrounded by Lamanites, and now we have the land of Nephi and the land of Zarahemla nearly surrounded by water, there being a small neck of land between the land northward and the land southward, right? So, I mean, it's pretty clear to see why the models look the way they do, right? Let's go back up here. Even my model that I drew as a 15-year-old kid, right? I mean, I've got some kind of a narrow thing here. But they've pretty much all, have a narrow neck of some sort, right? I mean, they're all nearly surrounded by water, and there being some kind of a narrow neck between this land northward and this land southward. And that is because that's what the text says, right? That's the picture it seems to paint. And I just want to, let me take a break for 1 second and point out that I have an article here when I'm talking about my narrow neck of land. So Mormon, who's writing this narrative, right, and copying all these records and compiling them, he's not from the land southward, right? He's from near the land of desolation. So, I mean, it talks about that, and he journeys to the land southward when he's a kid, and then takes control of the army, and then they immediately kind of head back up to the north. But he's undoubtedly, I believe, working off of maps, right? Because the directions are so specific, like they really are very specific and consistent, and we're going to get into that even more. So I think that this right here, right, this article has a picture of some of the many maps that exist in Mesoamerican kind of codices. And even though most of these were kind of made, by Spanish people at the turn of the, 1500s when things were transitioning from Aztec rule to Spanish rule, they still kind of show the idea and the records that a lot of these Mixtecs and Aztecs had. And they have maps. Like this is a great example. This Mapa de Tio Zacualco. It has, see these rivers? Like it has rivers on there. It has trails. Each of these is a little town, right? And so you would have a really good idea from this map, like what direction. And not only that, it has little footprints in the trails. Like the footprints in the trails say how many day journey it is between different things, right? You have like 5 footprints, meaning like a 5-day journey. And then you have the little town. And so I think that they had a pretty good idea where the rivers ran, where the trails ran. But maybe when it came to the shorelines, maybe they kind of simplified that. But they still knew it's like, look, we've got something over here, and we've got, does this mean like the ocean is down there? Or is that a river that's running down there? We're not sure. But they probably knew how to read these maps pretty well. But anyway, yeah, check that out. There's Wikipedia articles on all that kind of stuff. You can go to my site and see more of these maps, and the way they drew rivers and rulers, and they had a lot of really cool stuff. And I suspect that a lot of the Native Americans of North America had this too, even though they haven't been preserved. So let's go back really quick and let's keep going. Okay, so the land of Nephi and the land of Zarahemla were nearly surrounded by water, there being a small neck of land between the land northward and the land southward. We're going to read a little bit further before we continue on drawing our map. And it came to pass that the Nephites had inhabited the land of Bountiful, even from the east unto the west sea. Okay, now does it mean the east sea to the west sea? We're not completely sure, but we need to make sure that we understand that the land of Bountiful has a west sea associated with it. Okay, so let's open up our map. Make sure that we understand the land of Bountiful. Maybe the land of Bountiful is over here a little bit more, but there is an east and a west sea, and there is some kind of a a narrow neck, it would seem. But let's just kind of draw something kind of like that. Okay, and thus the Nephites in their wisdom with their guards and armies had hemmed in the Lamanites on the south. On the south of what? Right, so I mean, he's been talking about here how the Mulekites, or the people of Zarahemla, same deal, landed in the land of desolation, right? So far northward, right? Remember he says that that's the area that is so far northward. So they landed in the land of desolation. So it almost kind of makes sense that if the Nephites and the people of Zarahemla have this people, this other group that had like landed up north, and maybe they left a part of them up there, that there is kind of like this land northward that they're trying to not let the Lamanites go up to, right? Be these like really bad enemies. They don't want them to be able to go up and bother the people in their land northward. So let's keep going here. So, and the Nephites in their wisdom, their guards had hemmed in the Lamanites on the south, that thereby they should have no more possession on the land, no more possession on north, right, on the north of Zarahemla, that they might not overrun the land northward, right, which is the land of the Mulekite first landing. It's already talking about that. Therefore, the Lamanites could have no more possessions, only in the land of Nephi and the wilderness round about. Which wilderness round about? He already said. The wilderness kind of wraps around the land of Zarahemla. But they don't want them to be able to get up into Bountiful or Desolation, or where the Mulekites are from. Now this was wisdom in the Nephites, as the Lamanites were an enemy to them. They would not suffer their afflictions out of every hand, and also they, talking about either the Nephites and the Mulekites, or both together, I guess, might have a country whither they might flee according to their desires. All right, that is the whole chapter, right?